Okay, do we have any hands up for people who want to participate tonight?
Chair Hansen, we have one hand raised.
Okay. Go ahead and introduce them, and we'll give you 3 minutes to speak to the board. And your time will begin after you state your name and general address.
Great. The speaker will be Eric Sutherland. You should be able to
Okay.
unmute yourself.
Good evening, board. Could I have an acknowledgement that I can be heard at this point?
Yep, I can hear you, Eric, loud and clear.
Thanks, Jeff. You know, I sometimes just can't even fathom how poor the planning function in the city of Fort Collins is operating right now. And once in a while, something comes along that just mind-numbing in its import, just to underscore what I have been saying to you guys for several years. And most recently, it was comments appeared in the Coloradoan, confirmed by people who were at the Board of Governors meeting when Tony Frank said that they were going to use the SPAR process on the Hughes land. Now, I have come down several times actually talking about how SPAR is inconsistent with the requirements of our city charter, that it's inconsistent with good planning outcomes, etc. But if you take Dr. Frank's comments to their logical conclusion, what he's saying, what he's implying, is that any subdivision of state government can involve themselves in land speculation and obtain entitlements for development outside of any development review process in the city of Fort Collins. That is the most absurd concept I've ever heard. Yet I heard nothing coming back from the city to correct CSU in their erroneous legal interpretation of what was going on there. Nothing from any member of this board. That is the sort of thing when somebody says it, you stand up and you say, sorry, that is not the way we do things here. That is not consistent with creating good planning outcomes. And that's not consistent with our community values. And so I'll be the first one here to stand up and say that. And I will be writing to Dr. Frank and explaining that to him in the future. It's simply inconsistent with the way we do things, the way we get good results. The reason that Fort Collins is a great place to live is because we add much more to the process through citizen involvement and by applying the meager expectations of our land use code to the development process. I think it'd be in good form if this board this evening, impromptu, were to make a statement that we will not be using SPAR to allow subdivisions of state government to engage in land speculation in the future at the bare minimum. You can only imagine where that would lead if that view of legal possibilities were to take hold here or anywhere else. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eric. Do we have anyone else who would like to speak about a topic that's not on the agenda tonight?
There are currently no additional hands raised.
Okay. Does anyone on the board or on staff have anything to respond to Eric's comments? I don't see any hands up. I'd like to acknowledge his concern about the SPAR review. That's something that the process, that's something we've talked about as the board. It really ties our hands. I don't know if there's a lot more, you know, and the Hughes site has certainly been on our radar too. I think there's, I don't know if there's much more I should say right now, but it's certainly on our, the whole process is something that's been on our radar for quite a while. So thanks for reminding us about it, Eric. Okay, if there's, I'm gonna check. Bill, you have your hand up.
Chair Hansen, I wonder if we could have Council Yatabe comment on our ability to comment on SPAR, which I understand is rather limited.
Okay, Brad, do you have something to add to fill Bill in a little more?
Member Whitley, what kind of information do you want?
Well, it's my understanding that we are unable to do much with a SPAR review because of legal limitations. And I was wondering if we could respond to Mr. Sutherland with a brief statement explaining that to him.
Well, I don't have any comment directed towards Mr. Sutherland. I understand his concern. That's certainly a concern that's been voiced by members of the community. I think as far as the SPAR review is concerned, it is a limited review. If the board decides to deny a SPAR, that can be overruled by the Board of Governors, considering a SPAR from Colorado State University. And the SPAR is certainly much more limited in the scope of review. So we're looking at the location and extent and character. So it does not have to satisfy the specific standards, for example, of Division 3 of the Land Use Code, if that's what you're asking.
I was asking for a general explanation to help Mr. Sutherland understand that our hands are fairly tied by the SPAR process, and we really are fairly ineffective in dealing with it, which is my understanding. And I think you just confirmed that. Is that fair?
Well, I think, yes, to the extent the SPAR review applies, that is correct. It is as I've described it. It is much more limited than your general review power, for example, a project development plan that comes in.
Right. Thank you very much.
Michelle, you have your hand up.
I would just say that I would not be averse to having, perhaps not this evening, but after some time to review the land use code and look at exactly when a SPAR is applicable. You know, if the board or board members could be given a little chance to make a statement. I think we've got some time leading up to this, and I'm not 100% convinced that this is an appropriate use of the SPAR. So that's my statement, but I don't want to step all the way out on a limb, but wouldn't be averse to coming up with something at some point that looks more deeply at, you know, ultimately this is a development by a private entity and should fall under the land use code, not SPAR, even though CSU owns the land right now. So that, I mean, I think I agree with Eric. I think that this is an end run to get around our, and I agree also that our process is pretty limited even when we have full review abilities. Mm-hmm. So something, you know, if not this evening, but after having a chance to develop something or write something and you know, without on the fly making a statement, I'd be fine with doing something like that if the board was amenable.
Okay, Perry, you have your hand up. You have a comment?
Yeah, actually, I think Michelle addressed most of what I was going to say, but I guess I'd like to ask Brad. There's been a lot of citizen comment on this whole SPAR review, and I guess, Brad, do you have an opinion on the appropriateness of that SPAR review in this project, or is it too early to really talk about that?
Yeah, I was wondering if we need to be careful about talking about the project specifically. Maybe that's something Brad to weigh in on, but.
Well, there's been a lot of public conversation about it.
Yeah, there has.
Also part of the public.
I will say this is very early in the process. The conceptual review meeting was this morning, and information is currently being requested from CSU on some of these issues. There's also, I mean, the information they've submitted so far has been pretty much a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what they want to do. So the question you're asking, they are under review, but to the extent you want a legal opinion, that is not something that I would share in open session. I think at the time that it's appropriate, it may be something that you will want to consider to going into executive session to discuss. But my role is to advise and to provide a legal opinion on issues that you want the advice on, but now is not the time to do that.
Yep. I think at this point, a discussion about the SPAR review process in general might be appropriate, but how it applies to the project, you know, when we actually have a project in front of us, we may be able to make a determination whether it's appropriate for that process to be used for that particular project or not.
Well, it seems like
as a
maybe
broader discussion on the SPAR review, ultimately, if any changes happen, it has to happen at the state level. I've reached out to a state representative about this in the past. Didn't get much of a response at all. But if anyone's concerned, anyone on the board or who's listening, I think that might be the most prudent course of action right now. So just contact your state representatives and your state senators. Perry, you had something more to say?
Yeah. Yes, I did. You know, I guess this is, I believe, somewhat different than some of the SPARs that we have looked at before. So I would think that as part of this review, and maybe even before the review, at some point, we really need to discuss the appropriateness of this and what makes it appropriate as a SPAR review. And Brad should be able to help us out with that. We should be able to line it out what makes it appropriate or what makes it not appropriate for P&Z to consider. So I'll be looking for that in the future.
Okay. Michelle, you have more to add?
Sure, yeah, just maybe that for at our next work session, we could have some explicit guidance on exactly when the SPAR is appropriate. I mean, I'm reading the land use code and it says that its purpose and is meant for publicly owned or parcels owned by a public entity and for public buildings or structures, and that's pretty clear cut. And so I'd like some further guidance on that, because this is not the case. And we should probably, like you said, not be talking about the specific project, but I think we can talk about the SPAR process and how it's being, at what point, I mean, at some point, city staff has to say, no, you're not entitled to go to a SPAR for this particular issue. And I think that's a place where we need to have some.
And I agree with what you're saying, Michelle. And I think to avoid getting, there's a process for when we can provide input on a project and whatnot. I think the first time that we'd be able to comment on whether that process is appropriate for any particular project is when it comes to us.
I feel like at that point it's kind of too late.
But Ted, do you have something to add?
I think this conversation is premature. I look forward to a work session where we can talk about it a little bit more in a neutral fashion. But a lot of the SPAR process is determined by state statute.
Yep. Perry, you have more?
Yes. Yeah, I do. So maybe in a work session, we can talk about the SPAR process, not necessarily about this one, and what makes a project eligible for a SPAR review and what makes it not eligible. We could certainly do that in a work session, well in advance of any SPAR that might be coming up.
Okay. Anyone else on this, on the responses to the public input?
I'll continue to ask for that.
Yep. Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yep, Paul.
I'll just say that I think we've heard the conversation here and have a sense of what the board's looking for, and so I think Brad from the attorney's office and staff can get together and come up with a strategy for the best way to try to provide the right information to the board at the right time. So we've heard you, and we'll work on determining the best way to move forward with that.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Anyone else before I close the citizen participation portion of the meeting? Okay, I don't see any hands up. I'm going to move into our consent agenda.